We have covered some of the steps that would be necessary for spring garden preparation in the covering of steps for fall garden preparation. If we have taken the necessary steps in the fall, some of the things that we would be considering for spring preparation will already be accomplished, so we're not going to take a lot of time to cover all of those steps again. If you are just beginning in the spring, then it's important to go through the steps of soil preparation, of adding the adequate minerals and things that are needed, such as we covered in the fall gardening preparation. The differences between your fall preparation and your spring preparation will largely be that you're going to have to do some of the things in the spring that will not have the benefit of breaking down and becoming as readily available for the plants. If you didn't plow in the fall, you will need to plow or till your soil in the spring. Being able to plow that early enough that it can have some freezing weather on it will help to break that up and make it more loose and porous. Another important consideration is if in the fall it was not possible to accomplish the steps of preparation that were needed, then calcium and some of the other elements that are probably going to be needed on the soil will have to be added. However, some of these elements cannot be added in as large quantities in the spring as they would have been able to have been added in the fall. The calcium source and the phosphate source, as discussed in the fall gardening video, we can apply in the spring if we have not applied them in the fall on similar principles. And then we want to allow some time for those to work in the soil. The minimum amount of time that we should allow would be about 2 weeks before we're going to plan on planting seeds. Here we're at the bed that we prepared last fall on our fall gardening DVD. We didn't start fixing it right away in the spring. During the winter, the weeds are not growing because we have freezing weather and snow. In the spring, when it starts warming up, some of the weed seeds will sprout and they'll start growing. Now we're into the summer and the weeds have grown up, and we're going to mow the weeds down and prepare this bed to fix for planting some things. During the winter, there are several things that are happening, even though we don't see anything growing on top. The seeds are laying there in the ground, as in most all ground, especially topsoil. There are many, sometimes hundreds of thousands of seeds, even in a few square feet, that are weed seeds. They can lie dormant for many years, and they're waiting for just the right conditions of moisture, sunlight, and warmth to sprout and grow. So as it warmed up, these sprouted, and we're going to cut them down and prepare it. Another thing that's happening during the winter is there's microbe activity that's taking place. Even though we don't see much activity on top of the ground, microbes are working down in that soil. As long as it's not frozen, there may be a layer of snow on top. There may be bitter cold above the snow, but the ground is insulated, and down there under the surface of the ground, as long as it's not frozen, microbes are working, breaking down some of the mineral elements and preparing the soil for more soluble elements that plants can use to grow during the summer. So we've passed through the winter, the spring has come and gone, we're into the summer now. We're going to mow these weeds down and prepare it. Now we're ready to fix this bed. We've gotten the weeds mowed off of it, and we want to build a sod. Since we're on a hillside here, the soil can roll down the hill when we work on it. And just as we have made sideboards on some of the rest of these beds, we're going to fix up the sideboard for this one before we dig it up and smooth it out and get it ready to plant. So we're going to cut square ends on our boards and prepare them to put in on the sides of the bed. We use our square and pencil, and we'll just use a bow saw to saw the ends. We make them square so that they can fit together well. Turn this around and we'll square the other end. Thank you. This one's ready to use. We'll just set it down here. We'll square the end on another one. Now we're going to want to get our measurements and prepare to put this up. Let's measure up from this bed below us here. We're allowing 4 feet for the bed and 3 feet for the walkway between it. That gives us room to go through with a mower or a weed whacker or whatever we need to use to keep grass mowed down, and also room to walk in a walkway between it. So that means we want to start out here at 7 feet. And we'll have to go over here a little ways and do it again. And then again. These stakes I've already treated with used motor oil from changing the oil in our vehicles. You can see how it's darker there on the bottom. I just had a 5-gallon bucket, put a bunch of oil in it, and then put these in and let them soak for a little while. So that helps to make them last longer and prevent rotting as quick. Okay, let's pound this in here. That's good. Now what we're going to do is go ahead and nail it up, and we use that big hammer as a backing. If you will hold that on the inside, I'm going to nail through from this side here.
Okay.
And then there you go. Slide it down a little so the nail can come through. Let's do, well, we'll wait till we get the other, then we can get it all level. That's good. Now we can do the bottom on this one also, since we got it level. The next step now is to start in turning the dirt over with our garden fork. And if there's any big weed roots or clods, we'll pull them out. Put them up here in the garden cart. You want to go through and do this on the whole bed. This will get oxygen down in the soil, which helps the microbes, help loosen it up, put a lot of these weeds and things down where they can die and decompose. Also, the different trace elements and things that we put on last fall were on top of the ground. They have soaked down through the winter as it's frozen and thawed and as it's rained and snowed. But now as we turn the soil over and stir it up, that will help mix all of those elements more thoroughly in with the soil. Finding worms like this is a good sign that there are microbes and worm activity going on in the soil, which shows that the vegetation and humus that's in the soil is being digested and broken down. Some animal life in the soil is a good indication that soil health is developing. As we pointed out in the last DVD on fall gardening, it is possible to use this same method just with a small box or bed. Even if you're living in the city, you can start learning some of the techniques of gardening, and you can experiment just with a small window box. You can use the same principles, get some dirt, put it in your box and start building it up. Grow a few plants, even if it's just 2 or 3 squash or tomato plants. or even a potato. You can use the same principles on a small scale or on a larger scale. But the point is that you can start wherever you are, use whatever's available, and start developing your experience with it. You'll probably notice also that when we dug this last fall, the ground was very hard. It hadn't been worked before, but now you can see that it's much easier to dig. And as year by year we keep adding humus and organic matter, it will get looser and looser and easier to dig. There are three important areas of consideration in the nutrient and soil condition needs. These are organic matter, major elements, and minor elements. It's very important for us to remember these three areas because we need to evaluate each one and give some special consideration to them. Major elements and minor elements involve the minerals and nutrients that are used in the soil to a large degree, and organic matter involves the things that provide food for microbes and also carbon in the soil. The primary source of carbon in the soil is from organic matter. Many soils have been depleted of carbon to an extensive degree. Many years ago, carbon levels were much higher than they are now. Carbon is the basis for moisture holding retention in the soil, and the higher the levels of carbon are, the more is possible for moisture to be retained in the soil. If there's a sufficient amount of carbon in the soil, a person could have even 2 inches of rainfall on their land, and the soil would not have a leaching effect that takes place if the carbon levels were high enough. So it's important for us to give consideration to adding these things as much as possible back into the soil, and this can be done by the application of organic matter. And again, I want to mention these three areas: organic matter, major elements, and minor elements. We'll look at some of these in a closer consideration. Organic matter, as I mentioned, supplies carbon. It also supplies food for microbes. Microbes are very important in your soil structure. Microbes break down insoluble elements into soluble forms that the plants can use. So microbes are a special workforce for you. I like to think of them as one of my important garden crews, working in the garden night and day to help make food available for the plants that are growing. In 1 acre of good, nutritious soil, there may be 2,000 pounds of microbes. If you add all of these microscopic bacteria and microbes that are working in the soil all together, you would have 2,000 pounds of microbes. That's 1 ton. That's the equivalent of a large mature cow or a large workhorse. So think of yourself as feeding the equivalent of a large animal living on that 1 acre of land, and that animal is turning the elements in the soil into sources for plants to be able to readily absorb. Also, when we have sufficient organic matter in the soil, many of the nutrients can be held much better. They do not leach out of the soil quickly. Nitrogen is one element that can either leach out of the soil quickly, it can drain through the soil and wash out, or it can evaporate back into gas. In the air, we have about 75% of the air being nitrogen. It's a gas. But the plants get a lot of their nitrogen from the soil, And so the nitrogen that is present in the air has to be incorporated in some way back into the soil and be available for plants. Nitrogen can be attached to the particles in rain or snow, especially in an electric storm. If there's lightning and electrical activity, some of the nitrogen that's in the air will come down in the snow or the rain and can work into the ground. In Michigan, where I used to live, it was said by some of the old farmers that the snow was considered to be poor man's fertilizer, because some of the farmers found that if they would plow when there was snow on the ground, as long as they were able to go through with their tractor and plow it into the ground, it would increase the growth of the crops where they were able to accomplish that. They could see a difference in their field. And the reason was probably because they were getting some additional nitrogen from that snow. So we have these benefits from organic matter. It also helps to make the soil much looser if the soil has been heavy or compacted. Now that we've gotten the bed dug, we've accomplished several things. By turning the soil, we have mixed it with some of the things that we put on top last time, and we have also put more air down in the soil. The microbes that convert a lot of the mineral elements into soluble forms for the plants to use require oxygen. So by getting oxygen down deeper in the soil, we're able to enable those microbes to be more active. By mixing a lot of the manure and other things that we put on last fall, we're also putting more food for those microbes down into the soil. We're going to add a little more compost and other elements that will help to build up the soil. Every time that we work the soil, spring and fall, it's good to keep adding some humus or organic matter or anything that will help to build up the soil with more organic type materials. So we're going to get a little composted chicken manure. It's chicken manure we had piled up, and it's just been setting for several years. It's well composted. We wouldn't want to put fresh manure on here, and we wouldn't want to put anything that is going to require a lot of decomposition on in the spring. We can put that on in the fall, and the microbes can work on it through the winter, but we don't want to put those kind of things on in the spring because it requires a lot of extra nitrogen for the decomposition process to take place. The microbes get the first go at any nitrogen that's available if they need it, and to put the things on in the spring can cause problems that way. Also, putting fresh manure has a lot more, the manure has a lot more concentration of mineral salts in it that can burn the plants. And so allowing it to compost, to mellow, and for microbe activity in it is the reason for putting it on in the fall. But if we have a pile of compost somewhere that we have developed, then this is a good time to put that on in the spring or any time when you work the soil. You can add that in just as a soil amendment even through the growing season. Put some along the side and work it into the soil when you cultivate or hoe. We're going to put some on now to add to what we've done here. One of the things to remember in putting these kind of materials on the ground, both spring and fall, is that we're not just trying to put something on to feed the plants, we're putting something on to feed the microbes in the soil as well. The microbes are one of the main agencies working for you to turn the things into the soil into soluble forms that the plants can use, and in quantities that won't be too concentrated. And so putting on things to feed the microbes is very good for your plants. So as we put things on to feed the microbes will feed the plants. Now we have some leaf compost here. We'll dig some of that and put it on too. You may not have a pile of leaf compost that you've accumulated. You may have a place you can go out in the woods and just collect some leaf compost for making, or even leaves that haven't composted yet. You can collect them at whatever stage they're decomposing, pile them up. If you can grind them, that helps them decompose faster. You can grind them, pile them up, and then use them. If you're working in the fall, you can spread them out on the ground like we did last fall on this patch. Or if you're wanting to get something for spring, you can use what you have accumulated, or you can even go out in the woods and underneath the leaves you can find a layer of leaf compost that's already decomposed. Something like what you find here. It's very loose and porous. You will find this kind of material underneath the leaves in the forest floor. And this is good material to put on any time of the year. And we'll put a little of this on. We've had these piled up, so there's already some grass and weeds growing on top. We'll have to pull that off to get down to it. And then we'll take some and put that on. And when you have to pull up weeds like this or cut weeds anywhere, don't throw them out or discard them. All of these things will decompose and make plant food for you. And you want to conserve all of it you can. If you can't do anything else with it, or if you're afraid that it might take root and grow again, the best thing to do is put it in a barrel and just fill the barrel up with water and let it rot, and then use that tea that develops as the plants rot and ferment and putrefy. You will develop a very rich mineral and nutrient tea, and you can use that to water your plants. It will make them very healthy. But generally you can take the weeds, you can chop them up or pile them in with your compost. As we demonstrate in making a compost pile, you can use these kinds of weeds and stalks and things and put them in with your compost. But don't throw them out. Collect all the vegetation that you can, anything that's growing. You can even go out and cut tree branches and leaves and other types of things that will provide you with vegetation. And all of those things, as they rot and decompose, will make rich nutrient sources for your plants. So conserve and use all those things, even kitchen scraps. It makes me feel very sad to see people throw kitchen scraps out with their garbage when that's good food for their garden. When you mow your grass, you can collect all the clippings. It's an excellent addition to compost, or you can even use it as mulch. in your garden. One of the things I really like about leaf compost is that trees will send roots down deep and wide. They will pull up many minerals from deep down in the soil. And those minerals will get combined with the activity of photosynthesis in the leaves. And many elements are taken out of the air as well in the process of the leaf activity in the tree. All those nutrients are put into the leaves, and you can harvest that and put it into your garden by getting the leaf compost. I'm always on the lookout for anything I can add to my garden, and one day I saw the highway department cleaning up a deep bed of silt that had collected beside the highway where the creek had overflowed several times. And I asked them what they were doing with that, and they said they were just dumping it over the side of the road where they had room. And so I asked if they could haul some and dump it at the end of my driveway. They came and looked and checked to see if they could get a truck there, and they said yes, they could do that. So they hauled 4 or 5 loads of that creek silt and dumped it at the end of my driveway, and I was able to bring it up to use on the garden. It's very loose, sandy, loamy silt, and it has lots of the minerals and nutrients that have washed down out of the mountains down the creek when there have been heavy rains. So anytime you have an opportunity, it doesn't hurt to ask, at least if you see where there may be something you can get and put it on your garden. Many times people are glad to have it hauled off, even chips that the right-of-way crews clear along electric power lines and things like that. Sometimes if you see them working, you can go and ask them, and they'll bring them and dump them right at your place. They're happy to get rid of them. So be on the lookout for anything that will help to build up your soil, and try to collect as much as you can. So we'll put some of this creek silt on and add it in on our bed here. It'll help loosen up the heavy clay, have lots of nutrients the microbes will feed on. We've spread some silt on here from our pile of creek silt, and now we're working it in a little in the top couple inches and smoothing the bed out. We'll get it ready for putting our additional amendments that might be needed on before we plant. And if we come across root clods or other things we don't want to leave in here, we can just gather them out while we're doing this step. We'll finish up the last little part here. You'll notice we're also mixing in the leaf compost that we put on and any other organic matter that we've added that's well decomposed. Anything we put on in the spring and summer, as a general rule, we want to be something that has already had time to decompose. There are some things we can put on that don't have to decompose, such as mulch, but that will go on at a later stage after we plant. And that's only certain items or certain types of materials, such as hay or grass clippings. Those are the kind of things that work for mulch. Now there's another reason why we don't want to put on a lot of green material or fresh material, or even things like leaves and dead weed stalks in the time that we're planting and growing through the growing season, because things that are decomposing require a certain amount of nitrogen. Now some things will have an adequate amount of nitrogen in them for their own decomposition. Grass clippings are an example of things that have higher levels of nitrogen. Then there are also things like bean leaves or other types of green material. But if you put on dried weed stalks or wood chips or sawdust, especially things with more fiber in them, they require a sufficient amount of nitrogen to feed the microbes to decompose. And so the microbes, as we mentioned earlier, will take the nitrogen that they need, and they don't leave nitrogen enough for plants' needs. So that's one reason for putting on many of these kind of things that we want to decompose and build up the soil in the fall, or else put them in a compost pile and go through the decomposition process before we put them on the garden. Then we come to major elements, particularly minerals such as calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium. These are major elements that are necessary in the soil for optimum plant growth and optimum microbe activity. Calcium is alkaline, magnesium is alkaline, potassium is alkaline, and these elements provide a backdrop for much of the chemical reactions and transfers that take place in the soil. And we'll discuss that in a little more detail in a little bit. Calcium in the soil is like calcium in the body. In fact, in many of the comparisons between the soil and the body, we find that the elements occur in proportional amounts, calcium being the number one in both instances. Calcium is necessary for good, strong plant growth and for many of the reactions and combinations from other elements as well. If calcium is not present, they are not able to function properly, many of the other elements. So it's important to give first consideration when we're looking at major elements to calcium. Is there enough calcium present in the soil? And again, I would refer you back to the Fall Gardening DVD series. You can see there discussion and also pictures that we can use to indicate calcium needs in the soil and calcium deficiencies. If we are uncertain, a soil test will help us in finding that out. And of course, if we have not been able to do that in the fall, as early as possible in the spring that we could get a soil test done, that will help us know what things we need to put on the soil for our spring gardening development. Calcium is the first one, and we want to have a sufficient amount of calcium to enable us to have on a soil test of soluble calcium levels anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 pounds of calcium in an acre. available. If we have indication of calcium deficiency, then it's a good idea to put on at least 1 ton of lime or some form of calcium on the soil. Then our next important major element is phosphorus. We want to have enough phosphorus to supply what's needed for the plant development in the different plants in our garden. Phosphorus and calcium are both very important for the developments of strong plants, good root growth, sturdy tops. Then another major element is magnesium. Magnesium is present in most soils that have a clay base, especially the heavy, sticky clays tend to be very high in magnesium, much higher than they should be. And so oftentimes magnesium is not something that needs to be added to the soil because it is already present in higher quantities than really is good for the proper proportions. However, if the soil in your area is sandy, then magnesium may be needed. Magnesium helps soil particles to bond together and to be more sticky. In sand, this can be helpful because water can just quickly wash through the sand, and it can wash nutrients with it, and it can pass quickly out of the structure where roots of the plants are growing. And so magnesium levels can actually be increased in sand and help the soil structure, whereas in sticky, heavy clay soils, the magnesium level needs to be lowered in proportion to other elements in order to help loosen up the soil, to help the soil particles not stick together so much. Then potassium is another major element, one of the minerals very important for plant growth. Potassium helps to make sturdy plant structure. It helps to make thicker walls in the plants and thicker leaf tissue in the leaves. Potassium is very important for good structure in the plants. So these are some of the major elements, some of the main ones of major elements that we need to give careful attention to providing in the soil. If any of these are deficient, then we're going to have serious problems, even if other elements are all present. We have here the soil report from the soil lab, and it tells us a number of things that give us useful information in regard to what the levels of different elements are in our bed, as well as it gives a recommendation about some things to put on. Now, we supplied the information about what we plan to grow this year and next year as garden vegetables, and then we also supplied the information for the lime that we put on when we first fixed the bed last fall. We put it on at the rate of 2 tons to the acre, and we put down the month and the year that we applied it, so they've included that in their evaluation of the soil and in the recommendations they will make. Now we have several different items here, and I'm just going to point to some of them that are especially important for us to consider at this point. This tells us here of the different bases that are in the soil. We have a saturation percentage of 98% of the potential amount of bases that can be held in the soil. And this percentage here especially applies to calcium and magnesium. So the percentage of calcium that's in this base saturation ratio is about 76% calcium, and the rate of magnesium is about 21% magnesium. And these two together make up approximately the 98%. The rest of the bases in this saturation percentage are potassium, sodium, and a few others. Now here we see that the pH is 7.2, and generally it is considered that an ideal pH is around 6.5 to 6.8 for most garden products. One of the reasons for that is that that's the range where the elements in the soil, such as iron and other minerals, have a balance of being most readily available. As the pH goes down from 6.5 to 6.8, some of those elements become less available even though they're present in the soil. They're less available to the plants. As the pH goes up to 7 and above, some of those elements, such as iron, become less and less available. So the pH here is a little higher than what we really would consider desirable. We also see here that the phosphorus index, the I on each of these represents index, and the soil lab has figured out a rating which they call an index rating, and an index of 100 they consider to be the maximum amount that you would want for an optimum crop. If you have an index of 100, that means you don't need to put on anything, you've got plenty of that. In actuality, as I have evaluated these soil test results with some other soil test results from labs, and as I have experimented with the soil, I found that a higher index rating is oftentimes even better with this soil lab report. When you get soil test results, it's good for you to have some discussion with the soil lab and find out how their ratings would be understood in terms of pounds per acre of these elements, and whether the elements in their rating are soluble or whether it's the total amount that's there, whether it's soluble or not. So all of those need to be taken into account. With this particular soil lab, we have an index rating for phosphorus of 228. That's over double of what they consider to be the maximum amount you would want for optimum crop results. And one of the reasons the phosphorus rating is so high is because we put on some soft rock phosphate last fall when we were preparing the beds. So this tells us that the phosphate we've put on is showing up on the soil test report. The calcium is showing pretty high. The ideal percentage for calcium is around 65 to 75%, depending on whether you have a heavy clay soil or whether you have a real sandy soil. The heavy clay soil is better on the lower side of the ideal amount, and a heavy sandy soil would be better to have a calcium level on the higher side of the amount, up in the 70s. So this is a little high for the heavy clay soil we have. Magnesium is high because we want approximately 80% of our base saturation to be calcium and magnesium together. So this means, since 98% of it is covered with mostly calcium and magnesium, that means that the other bases are proportionally going to be less. It's like a pie. If we need a certain percent of the pie to be one element and another percent to be another element, but yet we have the majority of the pie used up with just two elements, that means the part that's left is going to be very small, not as much as it needs to be. So that's what we have here. We have more of the pie being used up with calcium and magnesium than is really ideal in what's on the base saturation percentage. Now, the main part of this percentage that we would want to lower is magnesium, because if the ideal rate is 80% for these two together, and an ideal rate here would be 65 to 70%. If we take, say, 68%, that means we'd want only 12% magnesium to come up with a total of 80% of our base saturation. So that means we want to lower the magnesium proportion in comparison to calcium. In order to lower magnesium, we can actually raise the calcium level some without increasing pH. There are several ways we can do that. In fact, we can add calcium, even though calcium is a base, we can add calcium in certain forms that will end up decreasing the magnesium and thereby lowering pH, because magnesium increases pH as well as calcium. If this was 0% magnesium and 76% calcium, the pH wouldn't be as high as it is here, because magnesium will increase the pH 1.4 times as much as calcium, unit per unit. So that means magnesium is more potent to raise the pH in the same amounts that calcium is available. So we want to decrease magnesium. We don't mind adding little calcium if we can in a form that doesn't raise the pH but will decrease magnesium, and the overall result will be to get our balance and ratio more in range. We see also here that manganese is very high in the index rating which the soil lab has assigned it. Zinc is extremely high, 379. That's almost 4 times the amount that they figure is good for optimum crop. Copper is especially high. Here we know that our soils are low in copper, and we added some copper, so it's showing up initially as a pretty high amount. Sulfur is an index rating of 63 on this report, so it wouldn't hurt for us to increase the sulfur. We'd like to get that up at least to an index rating of 100 here. And then we also note with our potassium, the K, that it's low on the index rating. It's below the halfway mark, 50 on the index rating. So potassium is one of the things that's low. So we want to increase potassium, lower magnesium, and we want to increase sulfur as well. Last year, I think we also put on boron when we prepared the field. Boron helps to feed the microbes, and especially boron is important in plant assimilation of calcium. The calcium might be available, but if we don't have a sufficient amount of boron available, then the calcium cannot be assimilated into the plant adequately. Now, they don't have on this soil test report a boron report. However, they do have a recommendation if they think boron is needed, and here they didn't think boron was needed. They put 0 for boron. Sometimes in the soil tests, especially with plants that are much more sensitive to boron, such as tomatoes and potatoes, they will put a recommendation for boron. But we have here the calcium, potassium, and sulfur that we're going to want to especially make sure to add. The potassium, calcium are major elements that we need to give a special attention to, and then of course the sulfur will be one of the smaller or minor elements. Sulfur is one of the higher, the elements on the higher side in the minor elements. It's one that's very important, and most of our soils around here in our area are deficient in sulfur. So these are some of the things we will add now. And there is a recommendation here that tells us of things to add. Nitrogen is not something that's evaluated in the soil test report for several reasons. One of the reasons is that nitrogen generally occurs in a gas in the air. It's incorporated into the ground, but it's easily lost from the ground as well. And it does not stay in the ground long. It will either leach out or return to gas or get used by microbes or plants. And so we want to make sure that we're supplying sufficient nitrogen daily, or not necessarily daily, but regularly through the time that the plants need it. And it does not stay in the soil like the other minerals do. Nitrogen is not a mineral such as calcium or iron. Those things will stay in the soil for a much longer period of time. Some of them, such as phosphorus, will stay pretty stable in the soil. So we have in our recommendation to supply some nitrogen, as we would expect, and we also have to supply some potassium. The rate that's mentioned on the soil test here, and the recommendation that's given, is 7 pounds of a mixture of 15-0-14. This is a standard fertilizer recommendation. Standard fertilizer products usually come with 3 different elements in them that are plant food amendments, along with sometimes inert fillers to make up the rest of the granules that are in fertilizer bags. And those 3 elements are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. So if you have a formulation that has the numbers 15-0-14, that would be a fertilizer that has a proportion of 15% nitrogen, 0% phosphorus, and 14% potassium. The first number represents the amount of soluble nitrogen, the second number represents the amount of soluble phosphorus, and the third number represents the amount of soluble potassium. As we saw in the report, phosphorus was already high on the phosphorus index, so they're not recommending that we put any more on, but they are recommending the nitrogen and the potassium. And it says 7 pounds of 15-0-14. Now if we want to compute this down to the size of our bed, we take this recommendation that's given here for 1,000 square feet, and we're going to take 1/10 of that for our bed and figure it up in the type of product that we'll put on for giving this plant food to our plants and to our microbes. The 15% nitrogen is figured in a 100-pound quantity at being 15 pounds. 15% is 15 out of 100. So in a 100-pound amount of fertilizer, that'd be 15 pounds. In a 100-pound amount of fertilizer, 14% of this ratio that's given here of what we need would be potassium, 15-0-14. So 7 pounds of that is going to be computed down this way. We're figuring 14% for potassium and 15% for nitrogen. If we figure on the potassium first, we have 14% of 100 pounds would be 14 pounds. Now we're going to be taking the ratio here that's for 1,000 feet and diminishing it down proportionally to 100 feet. So that's 1/10. 1/10 of 7 pounds of this mixture is going to be approximately 1 pound when we take it down 1/10. So 1 pound of, it's a little less than 1 pound, but we'll just average it out to 1 pound. 1 pound of 14% potassium is going to come out to about 1/10 of a pound for 100 square feet. This is 1 pound of actual potassium that we would have in this proportion. Let me summarize that again because it can seem a little confusing, and you want to be sure you figure out your calculations correctly. We have a recommendation here for 1,000 square feet, and the recommendation is for 7 pounds of a mixture that's 15% nitrogen and 14% potassium. So 7 pounds of 14% potassium comes out to about 1 pound of actual potassium. So we want to put on something that will give us the rate of about 1 pound of actual potassium for 1,000 square feet. Now we're computing it down to 100 square feet. We're scaling it down, so that's about 1/10 of 1,000 feet. So 1/10 of 1 pound of actual potassium required is going to be a little less than 2 ounces. So we don't need a lot, but we need a little less than 2 ounces of actual potassium. Now there are several things that we can use to supply potassium or phosphorus or nitrogen. We can either use what are commonly referred to as organic sources, or we can use what are commonly or oftentimes referred to as commercial sources, commercial fertilizers. There are commercial fertilizers that are non-toxic. They are formulated in chemical factories, oftentimes from mined products or from things that are combined in specified rates or quantities. They do not occur just in that form naturally in nature, and therefore people who are strictly organic do not want to use them. But there are some considerations that make it worthwhile for us to perhaps use them in some situations. One consideration is that if we're just moving out of the city and we get a little piece of property in the country and we want to start growing food, we are not able to immediately grow all the food that we would need the first year. That's really not a realistic possibility. We don't have the experience, we don't know how to deal with problems that we don't even envision will come up. And until we've been getting a little experience working with growing food, we don't know exactly what's needed. Even reading a book won't give us all the information or help us to understand the ideas if we could remember it all. And of course, we have a hard time remembering all the details. But as we work with the soil, we will be learning things and gradually improving. And the best plan is to start out small with something we can work with adequately and give it the best possible chance to produce well. And then as we learn, we can keep expanding and we can increase what we're doing. So that's one reason we're demonstrating here how you can do a small scale on one bed of 4 feet wide and 25 feet long. You can do several beds if you have the time, you have the space, and are ambitious. And as you become efficient and you know what you're doing, as you learn by sometimes trial and error, as you're able to ask questions from people who have experience, then you will be able to increase the amount that you attempt to do. But it's far better, it's a good plan to start out small. So we want to be able to scale these amounts down to just the small area we're doing. And if you're using only organic materials, then to supply potassium, we could use something like green sand. Green sand is one of the forms of mined product that's available that supplies potassium. To supply rock phosphate, or to supply phosphorus, we use rock phosphate as we put on last fall. To supply calcium, we can use lime, which is a mined product. You can get different forms of lime. To supply nitrogen, as we are recommended here in our recommendation, we can use something such as bean meal. Anything that's high in protein will also supply nitrogen, because nitrogen is the plant element that's the counter or corresponding element to protein in food. So if you have a food with a high protein content and you put it on the soil, that will convert to nitrogen for the plants. If you have plants that take lots of nitrogen up in their assimilation of elements from the soil, they will be high in protein. So any type of seed meal or bean meal that is high in protein will give you nitrogen. Even something like alfalfa pellets will give you nitrogen because they're high in protein. So we'll get some of these elements that we need here and we'll put them on the garden. I might mention before we do that you can also utilize, as I was describing, if you're just moving out of the city, getting into the country, and you need to do something to try to get some food at least as soon as possible, you may wish to use some elements that are readily available that don't take as long to break down. And you can use some of the commercial preparations that are non-toxic. They are non-invasive to microbes. They are able to work totally in harmony with microbes and give your plants something that they can use right away, and it enables you to get a crop and to have useful, nutritious food while you're getting your soil built up. I believe that the best combination to follow is to use some of both of these. Put as much organic matter on, use the different organic elements that will supply what you need, and also initially use the commercial preparations that are compatible with biological gardening that will enable microbes to work effectively, but will also allow you to get as much nutrition in your food as possible. And as you get it built up, as you get your reserves of mineral levels, then you can gradually work away from the commercial preparations, become less and less dependent on them, and you can utilize more and more the organic sources of things that you can supply from what's available readily around you. Right here we have potassium sulfate, or oftentimes it is sold under the label sulfate of potash. If you're doing a small bed such as we're doing here, a small amount is sufficient to meet most of your needs. This is a 5-pound bag. If you're doing larger scale, a number of beds or a field, then you can use amounts that come in 50-pound bags. Here we see on this label the guaranteed analysis is 50% of available potassium, and this has no nitrogen or phosphorus in it. These are elements that you can use to supply readily soluble forms of potassium. As I mentioned before, you could use green sand. Green sand also supplies potassium, but keep in mind, as I mentioned again before, the things used in strictly organic methods or procedures usually require a breakdown period of time. So if we put green sand on now, it will provide a benefit, but that benefit is going to be slowly developing through a period of time. It will not give a high level of potassium at the very beginning. We have a rating on here that says 7% of potassium available. The major amount of potassium that's in green sand will become available through a process of time, several years. And so we can put some of this on, and that will provide long-term release of potassium. We can also put on some of the potassium sulfate, which will give us something right away for the needs of the plant. Another source of potassium that you can use is ashes. Like the green sand, it's a slower release, but that's a good form of potassium, especially if they're hardwood ashes. Hardwood ashes are the best ones to use from your fire if you burn wood. Hardwood ashes will supply potassium for your garden. So we'll put on this bed here what we will estimate to be about 2 ounces of potassium sulfate. It's not much, just a couple small handfuls. And if you're uncertain about how the amount is going to work out that you need to put on, you can just use a little scale, an ounce scale, or even a gram scale. Now we also want to put something on to supply nitrogen, and we need about the same amount of it. It was pretty close on our soil test recommendation. We can use bean meal. We have here an example of soybean meal. Many of these types of things can be purchased at feed stores. If you are in an area where people have horses or cattle or other types of livestock that they will buy feed at the feed store to use. This soybean meal has been sitting a little while, so it's kind of congealed a little bit into clumps, but you can see how it is. You can just measure out an amount to spread on your soil. And we will supply in the resource portion of this DVD a chart giving you average amounts of different elements that are available in different forms of organic soil amendments. For instance, the proportions of nitrogen you would find in soybean meal or alfalfa meal, the amount of potassium you might find in kelp meal, and different types of manures. We will provide that information so you can evaluate and then compute about how much to put on to meet the needs of a soil recommendation for your bed. We'll put on some of this soybean meal. We can also use in the commercial fertilizer line. There are several commercial fertilizers that are compatible with biological gardening. They're not harmful to microbes if not put on too excessively. Anything, of course, we recognize is going to be a problem if we put on too much. Even water water is damaging to the microbes if we put on too much, because it closes up the pores in the soil and they can't get air. But that doesn't mean the water is toxic and we shouldn't use it. It's the important thing to remember to use it in proper amounts. So the same thing with these commercial fertilizers, that in proper amounts are non-toxic and they're fully compatible with biological gardening practices. We could use ammonium sulfate. Any fertilizer that ends with the name sulfate will provide sulfur. That means it's a compound that also includes sulfur. And since in this soil we noted that sulfur was a little low, we can add additional sulfur by using a sulfate formulation. So if we want to increase the sulfur level and we're putting on nitrogen, we can put ammonium sulfate. Ammonium fertilizers supply nitrogen. We have some forms such as ammonium nitrate and ammonium sulfate. The ammonium sulfate will give us sulfur as well. So we could put some of that on. We also know that we need to lower magnesium, and we can do that especially by putting on more calcium. That will change our proportion and lower magnesium. And we can put on a calcium form that includes sulfur. That would be calcium sulfate, or another name that's often marketed under is gypsum. So we'll put on some bean meal in order to give us some nitrogen on this for long-term breakdown, and then we'll also put on some ammonium sulfate. Bean meal is going to be a lower proportion generally than a chemically formulated compound, and so soybeans are on the average about 30% protein. That will compute down to a smaller amount of nitrogen, so we will put a little larger amount of bean meal on, and also because it breaks down slower. Another product that sometimes is available at feed stores is cottonseed meal. Cottonseed meal also is a high protein product. It's a seed meal. Most any seed meal will be higher in protein and therefore will supply nitrogen when it breaks down in the soil. Cottonseed meal can have some drawbacks, and it's good to check into the source if you can get it. Cottonseed meal sometimes comes from cotton that is sprayed at a much higher rate with pesticides than some other types of agricultural products. Also now we are having more and more likelihood of different things that we get, and this can be true of soybean meal as well, of coming from genetically modified plants. So those are things to evaluate and try to decide whether you want to use the product that's available and whether there might be any problem with it. Now, to supply our nitrogen and also give us additional sulfur, we're going to get our ammonium sulfate and put some of that on. We have here the ammonium sulfate is a formulation that is 21% nitrogen. The guaranteed analysis is 21% soluble nitrogen. It has no phosphorus or potash. The sulfur is not listed on here because generally The fertilizer formulations just list the 3 major elements that are in the 3 numbers. So this is 21% nitrogen. At 21% nitrogen, and we are wanting approximately 2 ounces of actual nitrogen from the ratios we figured out before, we would want to put about 5 times that much, since this is only 21%. So we've got to increase it 5 times in order to make the 100% nitrogen amount that we need. And if we need about 2 ounces of nitrogen, and we have 21% ammonium sulfate or 21% nitrogen, that means that we'll want to put on about 10 ounces of this. That'll give us 1 ounce or 2 ounces approximately of the nitrogen. I know figuring up the calculations can seem kind of complicated, but a little practice will help make it easier as you get used to it. And it is important to try to get them close enough so you don't end up with massive amounts more than you need, or you don't end up with a major deficiency because you didn't put enough. Now, since we have the green sand here, we'll put some of that on. We already had put some potassium sulfate to supply potassium. We'll put a little additional potassium on in the form of green sand. That will provide us with some long-term potassium to be available. Many times in different places you may not have access to some of these different elements, but we're trying to cover a wide range of things that will provide needed elements, and you can use whatever products are available that you can get. There's a lot of flexibility in working with the soil, and especially if you have soil that is largely clay. Clay has much more of a buffer, we might call it, availability to higher and lower levels of different elements without it having as much of a detrimental effect on the plants than if your soil is mostly sand. You need to be a little more careful in the possibility of getting too much of something on if you have sandy soil. But as a general rule, if you're trying to aim to be fairly accurate, you still have a margin of tolerance available, and using whatever you can get, remembering the principles that it's really important to have organic matter, and then attention given to major elements, calcium being the first one, and then phosphorus, followed by potassium and some other things. Then minor elements, particularly things like sulfur, boron, copper. Those are some of the ones that especially are oftentimes necessary to give attention to. Also iron. And if you get those supplied through some different forms of products that are available or things that you can get, you can start seeing results. And as you have experience working with it, you can fine-tune the results that work best in your area with your soil, with your climate. It may be a little different than in some other places. So that's one reason why, as you work in your own particular situation, you're going to gain experience that will work best for your situation. Now we've added both nitrogen and potassium. We still need to deal with our magnesium and calcium situation. We want to lower magnesium especially, and we can use another product that will supply sulfur as well as increase calcium levels, thereby lowering magnesium levels. Now, not all elements work like this, but magnesium and calcium are elements that are proportionally changing. If one is increased significantly, the other one will be decreased on that pie, as I was describing earlier, of the bases that are in the saturation percentage. So if you increase any one of those bases, others are going to be correspondingly decreased to a certain extent. So if we increase calcium and we increase potassium, as we have by adding potassium here, we're going to be correspondingly lowering magnesium some. We won't be able to ascertain exactly how much we're lowering it, but we can get a pretty good idea. A soil test will help us to know more precisely where we are, and it would be ideal while we're working to try to get the soil adjusted to the right balance of some of those calcium and magnesium proportions and things like that, to take a soil test at least once or preferably twice a year, in the fall and in the spring. By doing it early in the fall, we can find out what kind of things we should do into the fall and early winter that will prepare for the spring. Then by doing it in the spring, we can tell what kind of things we can do through the summer that will help to be developing as we work toward the fall, and that way we can keep making steady progress till we get the balances where they should be, and then it's more of a maintenance program to keep it there. So we'll put on some calcium sulfate, or gypsum as it's often called. It also goes by the name land plaster. This is just simply a form of calcium that's formulated from lime with additional sulfur. And we'll put some calcium sulfate on. This bag here says pelletized gypsum for lawns and gardens. And this supplies, as it says, calcium and sulfur. This is a product that's very widely available. It is oftentimes sold in the garden portion of major stores such as Lowe's or Walmart or other types of large stores. If you look for this at the garden department of a store or in a garden shop, just be sure to remember that they may not recognize it by the name calcium sulfate. You may have to ask for gypsum. Sometimes they will recognize it by the name calcium sulfate. Now, the rate that we put the calcium on in the fall was about 2 tons to the acre. When you are adding calcium to try to build your levels up, the initial amount that you would put on should not be any more than 2 tons to the acre. And after that, if you are adding calcium in some form of lime, then it's best to use much smaller quantities and keep monitoring the other levels of things in your soil till you get things about where they should be. And you should add in the spring, you can add in the spring and the fall no more than 1,000 pounds per acre, or possibly up to 1 ton if you still have serious deficiencies. But only when you first apply it. If it hasn't had any lime for a number of years and it's seriously calcium deficient, then you would add 2 tons to the acre, preferably in the fall. And if you're just starting in the spring, you haven't had any soil tests, you haven't done anything in the fall, if you're just starting in the spring, then even if you have seriously calcium deficient soil, it's best to put on just 1 ton per acre and then put another ton on in the fall. Once you put on the 2 tons per acre in a year, and if you did it in the fall, then the next spring you can put on more calcium if it's necessary, and put it on at a rate of about 1,000 to 2,000 pounds, maximum of 2,000 pounds per acre. If you only need a little bit of calcium, not as much, then maybe 500 pounds per acre. If we're going to figure on putting some on here to try to decrease magnesium because magnesium was so high, and we're also adding sulfur with the calcium sulfate, we'll figure on putting on at the rate of 1,000 pounds per acre on this bed. 1,000 pounds per acre, remember, is 1,000 pounds per an average of 40,000 square feet, or a proportion of 1 to 400. So that means that 1/400th of 1,000 pounds would be about 2.5 pounds. So we'll get about 2.5 pounds of calcium sulfate here, and that's what we'll put on the bed. Then we want to keep in mind minor elements. We want to take a careful look at minor elements. If the major elements are present, but we don't have minor elements in proper proportions available, then we will still have deficiencies showing up, or stunted plant growth, or other problems. These minor elements include things such as iron, copper, sulfur, boron, manganese, zinc, and even elements that are needed in very, very minute quantities, almost microscopic, such as molybdenum. Chlorine is another one. It's necessary in small amounts for plants. Most soil has ample amounts of chlorine, so some of these are not ones that we would need to consider adding in nearly all cases. But many of these minor elements, especially ones like iron and copper and sulfur, are deficient in the soils, and we need to give some consideration to them. In the resource collection, we will have charts and lists of sources for these different elements. Some of these sources are from organic sources, and some of the sources of elements are from commercial fertilizers. Now, I might mention a few things here in connection with organic fertilizers and commercial fertilizers. Primarily, there are 3 main approaches to gardening that are common today. The traditional agricultural approach that's used in agriculture business, we might call the commercial fertilizer approach, or the big agribusiness approach. Commercial fertilizers include preparations that have been made in chemical factories. Oftentimes they're made from elements that are mined from the ground and then treated with certain chemicals to break them down and make them more soluble and readily available to plants. Some of these would be things such as potassium, such as phosphorus, such as nitrogen. Nitrogen is oftentimes made from natural gas. It's treated with a certain process in a refining factory to extract and create the nitrogen for nitrogen fertilizers. In the situation of potassium, there are potassium deposits in different parts of the world, and particularly as it's produced here in America in certain states. There are potassium deposits where the potassium is mined and then it is treated with other chemicals in order to make it more soluble or available to plants. It can be either treated or combined with chlorine so that we have a compound called potassium chloride, or it can be combined with sulfur and we have a product called potassium sulfate. Oftentimes the fertilizers that end in a sulfate in their name are treated with some sulfur compound or element such as sulfuric acid to help to make the mineral element more readily available. In the case of phosphorus, most phosphorus comes from phosphate rock that's mined from the ground or from deposits in different places. Then this phosphate rock, after it's ground into a fine powder, is treated with an acid. In the case of triple superphosphate, which is a rating of 0.460 on the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium ratings that you will see on fertilizer bags, it will say 0.460, and that means that there's 46% of what is in that bag is soluble phosphorus. The phosphorus has been made soluble by treating it with phosphoric acid. This creates a soluble form of phosphorus, but it also makes a very acid form of phosphorus. The acidity of triple superphosphate is approximately 4.5 on the pH scale. Being so acid, when it's applied to the soil, it will start combining with alkaline elements in the soil. If there's calcium available, it will combine with calcium to make tricalcium phosphate. Once those have combined together, they're locked so tightly together that it's very hard to separate them and make the element of calcium or the element of phosphorus available to the plants. So these are some of the ways that commercial fertilizers are made. And some of the commercial fertilizers, such as I just described with the triple superphosphate or with the potassium chloride, these kind of fertilizers produce problems when they're applied to the soil. In the case of potassium chloride, the chloride converts back to chlorine when it breaks down in the soil. And what happens when you have chlorine in the soil? Chlorine is the element in Clorox that's used to kill bacteria. So when this chlorine is present in the soil, it kills the microbes and the bacteria that really are the ones you want to feed and support. So this kind of fertilizer, while it provides a soluble form of potassium for the plants for a period of time, it also is destroying the microbe population in the soil. So even though these fertilizers may help to temporarily at least provide sources of nutrients for the plants, they also have adverse effects or can even be actually toxic. In the case of one particular kind of soil amendment that farmers were buying and applying to pastures out in some of the western states, there was a situation that arose where a man had a number of cattle that started dying that were eating in the pasture, and he started doing research, and he finally traced, after doing some extensive lab testing and other research, it traced back to the soil amendments that he was putting on that soil that he had been buying from a fertilizer distributor. And it was discovered that the fertilizer actually was coming from originally an industrial waste that was being produced as a byproduct of an industry. That industrial waste was considered highly toxic, and it actually required special handling and special permits just to haul it and store it. However, the company that was producing this industrial waste also knew that certain minerals were present in that industrial waste, and so they conceived the idea of marketing this waste product for the purpose of soil amendments to provide those minerals. And so in the process of this marketing chain, the waste was transferred, it was hauled and then stored with the proper permits. Then it was bagged and it was sold as an agricultural commodity. The same permits were not required for this to be classified as an agricultural commodity, and so after it was bagged, it could be sold without the permits that were required in order to haul it and store it as an industrial waste. So just by changing the classification, it was possible to eliminate the need for the permits as a toxic material and change it into an agricultural commodity. And now the farmers were putting it on their pastures and using it to supply minerals to supplement the things that were needed for their pasture growth. But in this case, it was on in sufficient quantities that it was proving to be toxic to cattle, and some of the cattle were dying. So we have these types of problems with the toxic or adverse effects from some types of commercial fertilizers. But that does not mean that all commercial fertilizers produce adverse effects. Now we've covered our major elements. We've put additional organic matter. We have put calcium. We have put potassium. Our phosphorus level is good. And we have also added some minor elements, sulfur particularly. We want to give some attention to some of the other minor elements, but we don't have a recommendation or a report even on some of those minor elements. There was nothing on the report that tells us what our iron needs may be. Nothing on the report tells us some of the other different trace elements and minerals. So one of the things that we can do is supply, just in small amounts, some of these additional elements with products such as kelp meal or such as a rock mineral powder. There are a number of different products that are basically rock or lava powders that will supply many small trace elements in forms that microbes can use and that plants can benefit from. And so we can put some small amounts of some of these on, and most of these products will actually have a recommendation for the amount to put on per acre, and you can just compute that down to the size of garden or bed that you are using. One example would be kelp meal. We'll put on some kelp meal for additional minor elements. And this particular kelp meal that we have here comes from Maine. Kelp meal for soils. It's harvested from the ocean up in the North Atlantic, and it has recommendations for house plants, bulbs, vegetables and perennials, lawns, trees, and it recommends on large amounts of land up to 300 pounds per acre. On small amounts it has, such as vegetables, spread 1 pound per 100 square feet mixed into the soil, spring and fall. So this is something we can put on both in our spring and fall work. Now this is excellent for feeding the microbes with trace elements, and they in turn will prepare them and make those elements available for plants. So we're putting something on that's food for the microbes while they're working through the winter, and as they're working, they're breaking down other minerals in the soil that are there so that they can be available for the plants as well. And then these nutrients will be very beneficial. So we'll put on about a pound for our 100 square feet, since that's the recommended rate. This is a little more fluffy than a granulated fertilizer or than lime, so we'll be using a little more proportionally. You can see it's just a meal. It's the dried kelp ground up into meal. It has a little bit of an ocean smell, but it provides many of the trace minerals and elements that have been washed off the land back into the soil or back into the sea. They've come from the soil. So we're able to add them back to the soil in this form. Another product that is a rock mineral powder is called azomite. A little bit of that can be added. Another rock powder product is called vulcanite. There are a number of different ones. You can try varying some of them or use combinations of different ones because each will have a little more of certain types of elements than some of the others. So by using several, you can get a wide spectrum of many of the trace elements that generally are not even tested for in lab tests, but yet are important if you're trying to get the highest quality of nutrition from your plants. Many of them have been leached out of the soils, but because they only are used by plants in small quantities, plants will oftentimes not show a deficiency significantly, but yet the food will be deficient in that element. And it may suffer in the assimilation of other elements as well. One example is with calcium. You can have adequate amounts of calcium in the soil, and it can even be in soluble forms, but the plants will show calcium deficiency if there's not enough boron in the soil. Calcium is a major element, but boron is a minor element. But in small amounts, boron is essential in order for calcium absorption into the plants. So we want to make sure we have the minor elements available as they're needed as well. So adding some of these things like rock mineral powders and the kelp meal will help to make those available. We'll put a little bit of some rock mineral powder as well. This is a product called vulcanite. This has a guaranteed analysis of 0.7% potash and 7% iron. Iron is another one of the mineral elements oftentimes deficient in the soil. Many plants may not show a deficiency even though the iron is not at levels that would give optimum nutrition in the food. But by making sure that you're supplying some iron, especially if you know that the soil lacks some iron, you are helping to ensure a higher iron level in the food that you're eating from your garden. There are a number of other elements in this as well, but this just shows us that these two elements are definitely tested for and are available in soluble forms at these levels. This also gives us suggested application rates. In a lawn and garden, it says 40 to 80 pounds per 100 square feet, per 1,000 square feet. So that would be around 4 to 8 pounds per 1,000 or per 100 square feet. We're trying to keep straight our calculation when we're scaling down from 1,000 to 100 square feet. So we have 40 to 80 pounds per 1,000 square feet. We're doing 1/10 of that, so that's 4 to 8 pounds. Since we're putting on some other types of amendments, such as kelp meal and other rock powders, we'll use the smaller side of this recommended rate, about 4 pounds. As the name implies, vulcanite, this actually is made from several different types of material, and some of them are volcanic, ground up volcanic ash or volcanic lava with high mineral contents and high mineral energy. So this has several types of those combined together, and we're going to put some of that on this bed. One thing nice about doing a small bed like this is that you don't mind buying some things that would be fairly expensive if you were trying to buy large quantities of them, but you can buy a small amount. Or perhaps if you have some friends that are also gardening, you can go together and get together an amount at a cheaper rate that you can divide up and use for all of you. But you can put on a wider variety of things that might seem expensive if you bought them in large quantities, but you can really build up a small area and you can intensively produce large amounts of foods, more than might seem possible if the soil is really built up to be rich and nutritious and healthy. Now we have one more rock mineral powder here that we will put on. This is the one called azomite. And this has a listing also that is a tested and guaranteed analysis. This is a natural trace mineral fertilizer. It says it has 0.2% soluble potash. It has 1.8% calcium. Has a little bit of magnesium, a little bit of chlorine. It has cobalt, sodium, and it has a number of other things as well, but these are ones that have been tested for. And this is made from a natural volcanic ash deposit. We'll see if they have a recommended application right here. It says directions: add 1 heaping teaspoon per gallon pot, spread 1 to 2 pounds per 10 square feet, or it says add to compost or other fertilizer material and spread 100 to 500 pounds per acre. So we can put on this a rate that would be between the 1 to 2 pounds per 10 square feet and the rate that would be 100 pounds per acre. As you see, there's a lot of flexibility with how much to put on, and it depends on how much you have and how much ground you're trying to cover. A lot of times if you're uncertain, it's better to start out on the small side of the range and then gradually increase, seeing how the plants respond, than to put on a lot and end up having too much. And you'll also get some overlap of different elements if you're putting on several different types of rock mineral powders or products. Now, we've talked some about feeding the microbes. One of the things that we haven't really discussed so far in regard to feeding microbes that I'll just mention here at this point is that microbes, in addition to needing the different food elements to supply them with nutrients, they also need oxygen. And what we haven't talked about is they need sufficient moisture. So it's important to have sufficient moisture for plants and for microbes. And it's even good for the gardener to make sure that he's getting enough moisture, he or she. So it's always good to keep your water bottle close by so that you can be drinking some water periodically, and you'll be able to think better and work better if you have enough water to keep you going. Now we've got, again, our three major things that we are trying to supply to the soil: our organic matter, our major mineral elements, and then also minor elements. We've put some of all of these on, we've given attention to them. We're ready to rake it out and to plant some seeds and prepare it for growing. You may wonder what the chickens are doing here. We have several chickens that a neighbor gave us, and we decided to experiment with using them as bug collectors. They like to eat grubs and bugs, and if we just let them run loose during the day when we're out digging, they'll usually come running to see if there's any new grubs or bugs that we've turned up. Occasionally they do find an earthworm, and we can shoo them away if there's lots of earthworms, and we don't want them to be eating the earthworms. But a lot of times the grubs and the bugs that they consume make it well worth having them there. We also have Japanese beetles that bother our grapes and some of the other plants quite a bit. And I can walk down the row of grapevines and shake the leaves, and the Japanese beetles will fall off on the ground, sometimes in quite a number, and the chickens will scurry around and gather as many of them up as they can and eat them. So we have kept several of them just to use as bug collectors, and I think that it may help quite a bit in diminishing the problems with bug depredations in certain situations.